My name is Isabella Moore. I'm 38 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I believed my life was stable in the way that mattered. Not perfect, but structured, predictable, earned. I work as a logistics coordinator for a regional food distribution company in Philadelphia. My job is mostly schedules, inventory reports, and making sure trucks actually arrive where they are supposed to. It is not glamorous work, but it is stable, and it pays the mortgage. Most of my days start early. I am usually up before 6 o'clock, checking overnight delivery updates before heading into the office near the warehouse district. By the time most people in the city are getting coffee, I have already dealt with 3 scheduling problems. I like that kind of work. Systems, causes and effects, problems that can be traced, understood, and fixed. Life, at least in my experience, is easier when things follow logic. Daniel Carter is 36, my boyfriend. He works in corporate communications for a large consulting firm downtown. Confident, social, the kind of man who can walk into a room and immediately belong there. He knows how to speak so people listen, how to smile at the right moment, how to make people feel like they are part of something bigger. That used to be something I admired. We had been together for almost 4 years, living together for 2. No kids, just a shared house, shared routines, and a rhythm that made sense to me. From the outside, we looked stable. 2 careers, bills paid on time, occasional dinners out, quiet weekends at home, or short trips when schedules allowed. There were arguments, of course, but nothing that ever made me question the foundation. At least, not until about a year ago. That was when Daniel started talking about growth. At first, it sounded harmless. Work stress, new responsibilities. His company had brought in a new senior manager, Adriana. Early 40s, confident, direct, the kind of person who spoke about ambition like it was a moral obligation. Daniel mentioned her often. At first, it was normal. Comments about how organized she was, how demanding she could be, complaints about long meetings or shifting expectations. But over time, the tone changed. He stopped describing her and started quoting her. Phrases started slipping into our conversations. People stay stuck because they choose comfort. Most relationships fail because one person stops evolving. At first, I didn't think much of it. People repeat things they hear at work all the time. But then the comparison started. Subtle at first. If I suggested a quiet evening at home, he would sigh and say, I liked things too predictable. If I talked about finishing a project phase, he would call it safe, not stable. Safe. There was a difference in the way he said it. Safe sounded like failure. Then came the word he used more than anything else. Average. He never said it directly at first, just around the edges. Some people are okay being average. I don't think I can live like that forever. I noticed the pattern. I always notice patterns. It's part of my job. And once I saw it, I couldn't ignore it. The shift wasn't loud. It was constant. Like background noise that slowly becomes impossible to tune out. A comment here. A comparison there. Little cuts that didn't seem serious on their own. But stacked together, they changed the atmosphere of the entire house. Then one night, during a completely ordinary dinner, everything became clear. There was nothing special about the evening. I had made pasta. The house was quiet. We were talking about schedules for the week. And then, halfway through the meal, Daniel pushed his plate away. Not dramatically, just done. And he said something that didn't belong in that moment. He said he felt like he was evolving, and that our life felt stuck. I remember pausing. Not because I was shocked, but because the statement didn't make sense without context. So I asked him what he meant. Simple question. Direct. Instead of answering, he started listing things. Our routines. My job. The way we spent weekends. He said it was boring. He said I lacked ambition. He said I approached life in a way that was cautious and small. His tone wasn't emotional. That's what made it worse. It was calm. Dismissive. Like he was explaining something obvious to someone who just hadn't caught up yet. I asked if something specific had triggered the conversation. He shrugged, said he had been thinking about it for a while. According to him, the more he focused on personal growth, the more obvious it became that we were moving in different directions. That was the first time he said Adriana's name in that context. He said she pushed people, expected more, didn't tolerate mediocrity. The implication was clear. I told him comparisons like that didn't make sense. A manager at work and a partner at home are not the same role. That should have been obvious. He rolled his eyes. That became a pattern too. Over the next few days, the shift accelerated. It wasn't just comments anymore. It was lectures. If I spent a Saturday morning relaxing, he would question my drive. If I declined a networking event, he would call it a lack of ambition. Most of it was said casually, like background conversation, but the message was always the same. I wasn't enough. And Adriana, even when he didn't say her name, was the standard. I tried to redirect, asked him directly if he was unhappy, if something else was going on. He never answered directly. He just kept circling the same idea, that people grow at different speeds, that some push forward, and others stay where they are because it feels safe. One evening, he was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone when he said something that finally made the situation undeniable. He said Adriana believed relationships only work when both people are evolving at the same level. I asked him why his manager had opinions about our relationship at all. He didn't hesitate. He said they talked about life during long hours at work. That was the moment something in my mind shifted. Work conversations about deadlines? Normal. About someone's relationship? Not normal, not casual. I asked how often these conversations were happening. He dismissed it, said it wasn't a big deal, said she just understood ambition. And then he added something that stayed with me. He said being around people like her made him realize he wanted more from life. I asked him one question. More than what? He looked at me like the answer was obvious. More than this. And in that moment, everything stopped being abstract. He didn't just want more from life. He believed I was the reason he didn't have it. That conversation happened on a Thursday night. And once it was said out loud, there was no way to pretend it was just stress or miscommunication anymore. Up until that moment, Daniel had been circling around the idea, dropping hints, layering criticism. But now the message was clear. He didn't just feel dissatisfied. He believed he had outgrown me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I asked a direct question instead. I asked if he was saying he no longer wanted to be in the relationship. There was a pause. Not long. Just enough to confirm that he had already thought about the answer. He leaned back on the couch like the conversation bored him. And then he said something that sounded rehearsed. He said maybe the relationship had simply run its course. He said people stay together out of habit all the time. And he didn't want to be someone who settles. That word again. Settle. I studied his expression while he spoke. Calm. Detached. Certain. There was no confusion in him, no hesitation, just distance. So I asked the question I had been building toward all week. I asked if Adriana had anything to do with this shift. His reaction was immediate, defensive, sharp. He said I was being insecure, said I was trying to make something out of nothing. But then he added something that answered the question anyway. He said at least she understood what it meant to expect more out of life. At least. That word did more damage than anything else, because it wasn't denial. It was comparison. And that was enough. I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, just decisively. I walked down the hallway, opened the closet, and pulled out a suitcase. When I came back into the living room, he looked at me like he was waiting for a reaction, an argument, a plea, something emotional. There was none. I placed the suitcase on the floor beside him, and I said something very simple. If you believe you've outgrown this relationship, then there's no reason for you to stay here. For a second, he smiled, like I had made a joke. Like this was part of some emotional performance he could dismiss. But I didn't smile back. I didn't move. I didn't soften the statement. And slowly, the expression on his face shifted. Confusion first. Then irritation. Then something sharper. He called me dramatic. Said I was overreacting. Said I was proving his point about how I handled things. I didn't engage with any of it. I just repeated the same sentence. If you believe you've outgrown this relationship, you're free to go live the life you want. There was a long silence after that. The kind that stretches just enough to make everything feel heavier. Then he stood up, not because he agreed, but because he realized I wasn't going to argue. And without that resistance, without that emotional pull, there was nothing left for him to push against. He walked past me into the bedroom. I followed a few seconds later, not to stop him, just to make sure things stayed clear, controlled. He opened drawers, pulled out clothes, started packing. The movements were quick, sharp, anger underneath everything. He muttered things under his breath about how unnecessary this was, about how I didn't understand, about how I was making it easier than it needed to be. But I didn't respond. Because the truth was, it was easier once the illusion was gone. There wasn't anything left to negotiate. Within an hour, he had 2 bags packed. When he zipped the second one closed, he turned toward me. And for the first time since the conversation started, there was something different in his expression. Not regret, not exactly, but uncertainty. Like he had expected a different outcome. A fight. A breakdown. Something that would make this feel like a conflict instead of a conclusion. But I hadn't given him that. And now there was nothing left to react to. Right before he walked out, he said something with a slight smirk, like he needed to reclaim control of the moment. He said maybe he would stay with someone who actually understood him. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Adriana was already standing in the space between us. Unspoken, but obvious. I nodded once. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. And that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. Because there was no anger, no jealousy, no reaction he could use to justify himself. Just acceptance. He picked up his bags, walked to the door, and left. No slammed door, no dramatic exit. Just a quiet, controlled departure. Like he had already planned where he was going. That detail mattered. Because people don't leave that calmly unless they already have somewhere else to be. And that confirmed what I had already suspected. This wasn't a decision he made that night. It was a decision he had been building toward for weeks. Maybe longer. The house felt different the moment the door closed. Not empty. Just still. The kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts again. I stood there for a minute, just listening, waiting to see if anything in me would react. Anger, sadness, panic. But what I felt wasn't any of those things. It was clarity. Because the moment he framed me as something he had outgrown, the outcome had already been decided. I just chose to meet it directly, instead of pretending it wasn't happening. I walked back into the bedroom, looked at the space he had just emptied, and then I did something he would never expect. I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled up the information I had already saved earlier that day. Divorce attorneys, legal processes, property rights. I hadn't called anyone yet, but I had prepared. Because when someone starts talking about their partner like an obstacle, it usually ends one way. That night, I didn't text him. I didn't call. I didn't check where he went. Instead, I focused on what mattered. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and then sat at the kitchen table reviewing everything I had already gathered. Bank records, mortgage details, legal notes. By the time I went to bed, I had made a decision. If Daniel was serious about leaving, then I was serious about ending it. Not emotionally, but completely. The next morning, I woke up at the same time I always did, 5:45. No alarm needed. Routine has a way of holding even when everything else shifts. For a moment, lying there in the quiet, I expected to feel something heavier. Loss. Shock. Maybe even the instinct to reach for my phone and check if he had messaged. But there was nothing. Just stillness. Clean, undisturbed. I got up, made coffee, and opened my laptop to check overnight delivery updates like I always did. Trucks delayed in 2 locations. Inventory mismatch flagged in 1 warehouse. Normal problems. Solvable problems. The kind I understood. Around 7 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A notification. Daniel had posted something. Normally, I don't pay attention to social media first thing in the morning. But the timing, less than 12 hours after he walked out, made it impossible to ignore. I opened it. The photo was simple. A restaurant patio, morning light, a drink on the table, and across from him, Adriana, leaning slightly into the frame, smiling, comfortable, like this wasn't new, like it had already been happening. The caption was short. Something about surrounding yourself with people who push you forward. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. I looked at it for a few seconds, long enough to confirm what I already knew. Then I closed the app. No anger, no shock, just confirmation. By lunchtime, I had already made the next move. I stepped outside the office, found a quiet spot near the loading docks, and called one of the attorneys whose number I had saved. The consultation was scheduled for Monday morning. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just execution. Monday came quickly. The office was in a small building downtown. Neutral, quiet, efficient. Exactly the kind of environment I needed. The attorney listened while I explained everything. Daniel's comments. The shift in behavior. The night he left. The post the next morning. He didn't interrupt much. Just took notes. Nodded. Asked a few direct questions. The most important detail was the house. I had purchased it before Daniel moved in. The mortgage. The title. Everything was in my name. That simplified things. Legally, there would still be processes. But there would be no confusion about ownership. Then he asked the question that mattered. Did I want to try to fix the relationship or proceed with filing? My answer came without effort. If someone leaves to be with someone else, the relationship is already over. There's nothing to repair. He nodded, like he had heard that answer many times before. The paperwork started immediately. Financial records, property details, confirmation that we had no children. It was all procedural, structured, clear. By the time I left his office, the process had already begun. And more importantly, so had the separation. When I got home that afternoon, there were no messages, no missed calls, nothing from Daniel. But around 6 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. This time it was him. Not an apology. Not even a question about how I was. Just a request. He asked if I could bring some of his remaining clothes to the parking lot near his office later that week. Apparently, where he was staying, didn't have enough space. He didn't say where. He didn't need to. I read the message once, then set my phone down, and didn't respond. Not because I was trying to punish him, but because responding would open a door I had already decided to close. My attorney had been clear. Keep communication minimal. Logistical, controlled. Anything else just creates opportunities for confusion or manipulation. Over the next few days, I focused on preparation. Documents, accounts, everything organized, everything accounted for. It was methodical work, and it helped because it gave my mind something to hold on to that wasn't emotional. Meanwhile, his life was unfolding publicly. Photos, stories, dinners, walks, places he had never suggested we go together. It was almost deliberate, like he wanted it to be seen. I didn't go looking for it, but enough surfaced through mutual connections to make the situation obvious. He wasn't transitioning. He had already transitioned. By Thursday, I made another decision. I blocked him. Phone, social media, everything. Not out of anger, but necessity. There was no reason to let his actions continue to reach into my space. The process was already in motion, and I needed clarity, not noise. That evening, the house felt different. Not empty, just quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. No commentary, no subtle criticism, no tension sitting just under the surface. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I could think without anticipating his reaction to it. That's when I realized something. Blocking him wasn't about avoiding him. It was about removing his influence, his choices, his voice. They no longer had access to my life, and that mattered. The weekend after that, I slowed down. Took a long walk through the city. Stopped for coffee without checking the time. Sat in silence without feeling like I needed to fill it. There were reminders, of course. His things, small traces of routines we used to share. But I handled them the same way I handled everything else. Logically, I boxed what was left, labeled it, set it aside. No emotion, just process. Friends started mentioning things, carefully. Neutral tones, sightings of him and Adriana, events, dinners, public appearances. I listened, acknowledged, and moved on. Because none of it changed the outcome. If anything, it confirmed it. By the middle of the week, everything was ready. Documents finalized, details checked, nothing left unresolved. The situation had moved from emotional to procedural, exactly where I wanted it. And in that transition, I found something I hadn't expected. Relief, not because of what happened, but because of how it ended. Clean, clear, without confusion, without delay. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was managing. And that changed everything. By the following week, the filing was official. The attorney submitted everything. I received confirmation that the process had started. And with that, something settled. Not emotionally, structurally, like a system locking into place after all variables have been accounted for. There were still steps ahead, timelines, reviews, final approvals. But the direction was no longer uncertain. It was moving forward. And more importantly, it was no longer tied to him. I didn't check his social media anymore. Didn't ask mutual friends for updates. Didn't wonder where he was or what he was doing. That part of my life had already closed. Not because of time, but because of clarity. A few logistical things remained. His belongings, the last of what he had left behind. I arranged for a friend to handle it. A neutral exchange. No direct contact. No unnecessary conversation. Everything stayed consistent with the boundaries I had already set. And it worked. There were no complications. No attempts to reopen communication. No emotional detours. Just completion. Work continued as usual. Schedules, reports, deadlines. The same rhythm that had always grounded me. But now it felt different. Not smaller. Not limited. Just mine. Evenings were quiet, but not empty. There's a difference. Quiet, when it's chosen, feels like control, not absence. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. How much mental energy I used to spend anticipating his reactions, adjusting my words, explaining my choices, defending routines that never needed defending. That was gone, completely. And in its place, there was space to think, to decide, to exist without being evaluated. Friends continued to mention him occasionally, always carefully, always neutral. But the message was consistent. He was fully immersed in his new life, public, visible, unapologetic. And every time I heard it, I felt the same thing. Confirmation, because it meant I had understood the situation correctly from the beginning. There was no misunderstanding, no temporary phase, no confusion to resolve. He had already left. Long before he walked out the door. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It clarified everything. The paperwork moved quickly. No disputes, no complications. The house remained mine. Accounts were separated cleanly. There were no shared assets that created friction. Everything unfolded exactly as it should when both sides have already moved on. A few weeks later, it was done. Finalized. Official. I woke up early that morning, same as always. Took a long walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool, the streets quiet, and for the first time since everything started, there was nothing pending. No decisions left. No outcomes waiting to be determined. Just completion. When I got back, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and let the silence settle. Not heavy, not empty. Just steady. 9 years of shared life, reduced to documents, signatures, and a clean legal separation. It could have felt like loss, but it didn't, because the truth was, that version of the relationship had already ended long before the paperwork caught up. What remained now wasn't grief. It was clarity. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt my routine, not from scratch, but with intention. Work stayed the same, but outside of it, I started choosing things differently. Walks without checking my phone. Evenings without background tension. Weekends that didn't revolve around managing someone else's expectations. The house changed too. Not physically, but in how it felt. It was no longer a shared space filled with subtle criticism. It was stable again. Quiet in the right way. Safe. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. He hadn't just been criticizing my life. He had been slowly reshaping how I saw it. Making stability feel like failure. Making consistency feel like weakness. And the moment he left, that distortion disappeared. What I had built wasn't small. It was solid. And there's a difference. Looking back, there was no dramatic collapse. No explosive ending. Just a sequence of decisions. Clear, measured, intentional. He chose a different path, and I chose not to follow. There was no need for revenge. No need for confrontation. Because the outcome spoke for itself. He needed constant movement. External validation. Something that always pushed forward. I needed clarity. Structure. Control. And those two things were never going to align. The difference is, I recognized it when it mattered, and acted accordingly. Now, when I think about him, about them, it's distant, detached. Not because it didn't matter, but because it doesn't anymore. The chapter is closed, completely. And what comes next is mine, not influenced, not compared, not measured against someone else's expectations. Just mine. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough.